Well, state officials are looking at what for years was considered a nuisance, now as a tool to fight wildfires and repair waterway.
In the 1770s, the naturalist William Bartram traveled through the Florida Panhandle, documenting the region's wildlife in extraordinary detail. And among the creatures he recorded were beavers, actively building dams and lodges across the waterways of what is now northern Florida. Spanish explorers who had passed through the region even earlier described a landscape laced with ponds and marshes, a wetland-rich environment beavers had helped shape for thousands of years before any European ever set foot there. By the early 20th century, every one of those beavers was gone. The species had been trapped out of Florida so completely that, for more than 4 decades, most wildlife officials simply assumed beavers no longer belonged in the state at all. What happened next, once wildlife agencies decided to test that assumption, produced a recovery so fast and so thorough that within a matter of decades, the same officials who had reintroduced beavers to the region found themselves managing an entirely different problem, too many of them. The collapse itself followed the same pattern that wiped out beaver populations across most of North America during the 19th century. Beaver pelts were an extraordinarily valuable commodity in the international fur trade, used to make the felted hats that were fashionable across Europe and America for generations. And unregulated trapping steadily eliminated beaver populations from one region after another as demand outpaced any natural ability the species had to recover. In Florida specifically, this pressure, combined with early agricultural development that drained and altered many of the wetland habitats beavers depended on, pushed the species to local extinction by roughly 1900. From 1895 until 1940, beavers were essentially absent from Florida and much of the surrounding southeastern United States, a near half-century gap during which an animal that had shaped the region's wetlands for millennia simply was not there anymore. The scale of the 19th century fur trade that erased beavers from Florida in the first place is worth pausing on, because it explains why the collapse was so total and so fast. Beaver felt, produced by processing the animal's dense underfur, became the standard material for a particular style of hat that dominated fashion across Europe and colonial America for well over a century. Demand was high enough, and largely unregulated for most of that period, that trapping pressure simply outpaced any beaver population's ability to reproduce and recover. Estimates for the pre-colonial beaver population across all of North America run as high as 60 million animals. By the time serious conservation regulation finally arrived in the early 20th century, that population had been reduced to a small fraction of its original size almost everywhere the fur trade had reached, Florida included. The turnaround began not in Florida itself, but next door in Alabama. During the 1940s, wildlife officials in Alabama launched a beaver reintroduction program aimed at restoring the species to parts of its former range in the state. Almost immediately, something became clear that would end up mattering enormously for Florida's own recovery. Beavers reintroduced into the region did not stay neatly within state lines. As the Alabama population grew and expanded, beavers began moving naturally across the border into the Florida Panhandle, recolonizing rivers and wetland systems on their own, without any formal Florida-based program directing them there. Wildlife biologists tracking this unplanned expansion documented West Florida's beaver population beginning a genuine rebound by the 1940s, driven directly by this cross-border spread from Alabama's reintroduction effort. Encouraged by these early results and recognizing that some parts of Florida's historic beaver range remained too isolated for the species to reach on its own, Florida wildlife officials pursued a small number of additional, targeted local reintroductions during the following decade, placing beavers directly into suitable but unoccupied habitat that natural dispersal from Alabama was unlikely to reach. What followed defied the cautious expectations of the biologists who had planned the recovery. Rather than slowly re-establishing a modest, scattered population, as many similar reintroduction efforts elsewhere in the country had done, Florida's beavers expanded rapidly and aggressively across the Panhandle's extensive river and wetland network. Surveys tracking beaver range across North Florida from the late 1950s through the late 1980s documented a population that did not merely recover, but overran its available habitat, spreading into essentially every suitable waterway across the region within a few short decades. A detailed survey published in the Florida Field Naturalist, tracking the species' documented range across North Florida from 1957 through 1987, gives a clear picture of just how completely beavers had reoccupied the panhandle by the late 20th century. Researchers compiling reports from biologists, foresters, park rangers, and extension agents across the region found beaver activity recorded in essentially every river system across North Florida, a near-total reversal from the species' complete absence just a few decades earlier. The same survey noted that further formal reintroductions into unoccupied panhandle habitat had become entirely unnecessary by that point, since the existing population, driven by natural dispersal alone, was already filling in whatever gaps remained. By the time later wildlife surveys assessed the population's status, the results were almost the exact opposite of what a typical species reintroduction produces. Rather than remaining rare or vulnerable, beavers had become so successful and so widespread across the Florida Panhandle that they were frequently classified as a nuisance species by landowners, blamed for flooding agricultural fields, damaging timber stands, and undermining roads and railway lines with their dam building activity. One study tracking beaver-related flooding across the broader southeastern United States found beaver impoundments had inundated hundreds of thousands of acres of land in neighboring Georgia alone during a single decade, a scale of impact that would have seemed almost unimaginable to the wildlife officials who had cautiously reintroduced the species to the region just a generation earlier. Understanding why the beavers rebounded quite this dramatically requires looking at what beavers actually do to a landscape once they establish themselves. Beavers are ecosystem engineers, an animal capable of physically reshaping its environment far beyond what its own size would suggest. Every dam a beaver builds slows moving water, forcing it to spread sideways into the surrounding floodplain rather than rushing downstream in a single narrow channel. Over time, this creates a complex mosaic of ponds, wetlands, and slow-moving side channels in place of what might otherwise be a simple, fast-flowing stream. Because each new pond and wetland the beavers create tends to attract more beavers looking to establish their own territories nearby. A recovering beaver population in suitable habitat can grow at a rate that outpaces almost every other reintroduced mammal species. Each generation of dams essentially building new real estate for the next generation of beavers to move into. It helps to understand exactly how a beaver colony reshapes a landscape once it moves in, since the mechanism explains why the recovery accelerated the way it did. Beavers are triggered to build and repair dams largely by the sound and sensation of moving water, an instinct strong enough that captive beavers have been observed attempting to dam the sound of running water played from a speaker. In the wild, this drives a family group, typically a breeding pair along with kits from the current and previous year, to fell small trees and shrubs, drag branches and mud into a stream bed, and pack the resulting structure tightly enough to slow or stop the current. Each dam creates a pond upstream, and beavers will often construct a series of dams along a single stream reach, forming a connected chain of ponds rather than just one isolated pool. As young beavers reach maturity and disperse to establish their own territories, they tend to move along waterways in search of new, undammed stretches of stream, meaning a single successful colony can seed several new colonies downstream or upstream within just a few years. That compounding pattern, one colony's success directly enabling several more, is a large part of why Florida's beaver population expanded as quickly as it did once it had a foothold in the Panhandle. That self-reinforcing growth pattern helps explain why Florida's Panhandle rebound happened as quickly as it did, and also why it eventually became a genuine management headache. By the late 20th century, wildlife officials in Florida had shifted from asking how to help beavers recover to asking how to manage a population that no longer needed any active intervention to sustain itself at all. Florida's beaver is today classified as a native species with a standard year-round hunting and trapping season, the same regulatory framework used for common, well-established wildlife rather than any kind of rare or protected animal, a striking contrast to the near-total absence the species had experienced across the state just a few generations earlier. There is, however, a genuine and lasting limit to just how far this recovery reached, and it is worth being precise about it rather than overselling the story. Beavers rebounded dramatically across North Florida and the Panhandle, but the species remains largely absent from peninsular Florida, the long stretch of the state running south from roughly the Ocala area down through the rest of the peninsula. This is not simply an artifact of incomplete recovery efforts. Wildlife biologists studying Florida's beaver range have suggested it may reflect a genuine natural limit on the species' historic distribution, possibly related to the isolation of more southerly river systems from the panhandle waterways beavers were expanding through, along with climate and habitat differences further south that may simply fall outside what the species can readily colonize. Researchers reviewing the state's beaver population noted that further local reintroductions into a handful of specific river systems, including the Ocklawaha, Wakasasa, and Withlacoochee rivers and certain tributaries of the St. Johns River, could plausibly extend the species' range further south if isolation from existing panhandle populations were determined to be the primary barrier, though no comprehensive program to test that has been carried out at the scale of the original 1940s and 1950s efforts. The broader pattern seen in Florida, extirpation by unregulated fur trapping, a multi-decade absence, and then an unexpectedly rapid, self-sustaining recovery once reintroduction and legal protection removed the original pressure, repeated itself across much of the southeastern United States during the same era. Names like Beaver Creek and Beaver Dam Creek appear on maps across Georgia dating back to the late 1700s, evidence of a species that had once been common across the entire region before the fur trade very nearly erased it. By the second half of the 20th century, beavers had reoccupied nearly every part of the American South except peninsular Florida, including, in a detail few visitors would expect, established populations within the city limits of major urban areas like Raleigh and Durham in North Carolina. Florida's experience also mirrored what was happening simultaneously across much of the rest of the American South. In South Carolina, the beavers' documented county-level range expanded from just 12 counties in 1966 to 28 counties by the late 1970s. In Mississippi, the total area affected by beaver dam impoundments grew by more than 300% over a single decade. Railroad and transportation infrastructure across the region felt the impact directly. One major freight line running between Mississippi and the Florida Panhandle required more than 40 separate beaver control operations between 1979 and 1983 alone, just to keep the tracks clear of beaver-created flooding. None of this reflected a population still struggling to recover. It reflected a population that had recovered so completely it was now reshaping infrastructure decisions across an entire region. What makes Florida's specific recovery worth returning to is not any single dramatic release event, since no evidence supports the idea of one large, deliberate mass release onto a single tract of degraded land. What actually happened was quieter and, in its own way, more remarkable. A modest cross-border spread from Alabama's reintroduction program, reinforced by a handful of small, targeted local releases into isolated habitat, was enough on its own to rebuild a population that had been completely absent for 4 decades, so effectively that within another few decades, wildlife managers were dealing with an overabundance problem rather than a scarcity one. The land the beavers moved into was never a lifeless, treeless wasteland in the way that phrase suggests. It was simply land that had gone without its most important aquatic engineer for so long that most people had forgotten it needed one at all. If stories like this one about how quickly a landscape can recover once the right species is finally allowed back into it are the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.